Well, I got my phone on vibrate. Let me make sure I got my work phone. Yep, work phone's on vibrate. Can we pause the recording for like 10 minutes, or we're just going to record us talking for 10 minutes and people will have to fast forward?
Uh, Let me pause recording. Well, good morning, everyone. This is your November Southeast Chapter NAHMMA webinar. The topic today is hazardous waste container management, and the presenter, the Andrea Sturmer with North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Andrea is a board member for the Southeast Chapter, past president, and an experienced SQG and HHW technician with experience in multiple counties in Florida, as well as her current position now in North Carolina. And we will also have Jerry Javier on board. He will be our moderator and will cover assisting Andrea with the Q&A. At various points during the presentation, Andrea will be asking questions and feedback from the attendees. Please use the Q&A tab to present your response, and Jerry will give the responses to Andrea. And then at the end of the presentation, we will have a general Q&A section. So, and this is being recorded. We will plan to have the recording and slide deck available on the member section of the NAHMMA website eventually. It may take a week or two, but we should have it up there as soon as we can. All right. So, Andrea, it is now yours.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate the introduction. This is my contact information. I know most of you probably are not from North Carolina, but if you can still reach out to me to ask your questions. Keep in mind that the presentation I'm going to be giving is the federal requirements. I have a couple of North Carolina specific things, and I did throw in a Florida specific thing. Your state may be more stringent than the federal requirements. Also, throughout the presentations, you may see some check boxes with the generator classification, SQG, LQG, VSQG for very small quantity and large quantity generators, and that will show you what that topic applies to. The majority of the presentation is going to be for SQGs and LQGs because VSQGs are not subject to very little requirements when it comes to containers. So you will see something about that at the end. Also, so we're going to talk about, first of all, what is a container? It might not actually be as obvious as you think. We're going to talk about the types of areas that these containers can be accumulated in, which are satellite accumulation areas or SAAs. We're going to have some examples of satellite accumulation areas, and that's where I'm going to want some feedback from you guys. We're going to talk about the most frequently asked questions about satellite accumulation areas, and then we'll get into the central accumulation area or CAAs, and we'll go into what the requirements are for containers being accumulated and in either or both of these either of these areas. And there's going to be a lot of container examples. And I do encourage you guys to give me some feedback on what you're seeing, because these are all photos that I've taken during inspections and scenarios that I've had to work through to determine whether or not it was acceptable for a satellite accumulation area, for example. So let's go ahead and get started. And you probably did not hear that I lost my docking station this morning, so I lost all my monitors and I'm limited to one little screen, you know, for little problems, but now I lost all my notes. So I had to go ahead and print some stuff. So if you hear some paper rustling, that's what happened this morning. So first of all, let's talk about what a container is. It's defined in 40 CFR 260.10, and you see the definition up here. The key with what a container is that it's portable. And EPA specifically made a broad definition to make sure that they can encompass all different kinds of portable devices that can be used to manage hazardous waste. And here in these photos, you see the traditional size containers you may run into, such as 55-gallon containers, drums, a 5-gallon bucket, and then a commercial chemical product stored in its original, I don't know, 1 or 2 quart container there. But what about these? We have here a flammable cabinet on the left. We're going to talk about that on another slide. Containers can also be tanker trucks and roll-off boxes. The primary difference between a container and a tank is that a container is going to be portable, where a tank is going to be stationary, normally bolted down. The thing you should keep in mind when you're thinking about portable is it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be able to physically be able to move it when there's waste in it. Obviously, you're not going to be able to push this roll-off when it's full of waste, but it's still considered a container. And some states may have more stringent requirements or interpretations of what they consider a container. So here's that flammable cabinet. Do you feel that this could be a container? Is it portable? Can it contain the waste? Let's see, Jerry, if you've got any. Remember, use the Q&A to give feedback. Oh, I see that. I think we got one.
Right.
All of
Catherine
a sudden, the thing lowered on me.
Catherine Eichner responded and she said no.
Actually, the EPA does have a RCRA online document that talks about how flammable cabinets can act as a container as long as they're not bolted down and there's no openings. So if there's any openings, they would have to be closed. There is a RCRA online document. We call these ROs. It's 14587. If anybody, and maybe, I don't know, Jerry, if you can type that in there, but it's RCRA online document 14587 talks about that flammable cabinets can be used as a container for satellite accumulation areas. And that means that the container markings are going to need to be on the outside of the container, and everything that's placed inside the flammable cabinet does not have to be marked with the words hazardous waste and the other requirements. For some reason, if they bolted down the cabinet, then it's no longer a container, it's not portable. And then each container that's placed in the cabinet would then have to meet the container management requirements. But this actually can act as a container.
Yeah,
So we're going to talk. Go ahead.
Could you repeat the document number, please?
Sure, it's RO 14587. So when you search, you would search EPA RCRA online and then that number, and that RCRA online documents are when different agencies or people reach out to EPA and ask their opinion on a regulation. And this is a good one, I think, because I have a lot of boat manufacturers that will use these. Actually, I have a lot of facilities. I have laboratories that will use the flammable cabinet as a container because they're placing very small waste inside of it. I have boat manufacturers doing their hot pots in there. So I am seeing this more frequently, and I do tell my facilities that if it's easier for them to do that, that's an option. Okay, so we're going to talk about the types of accumulation areas that containers can be accumulated in. And you hear me talking about containers. There's other types of units that hazardous waste can be accumulated in, such as tanks. But the presentation today is just going to focus on containers. And we're going to talk about a few of these photos in detail here in a little bit. So just remember, in general, hazardous waste can only be accumulated in units, such as a container, that are either in satellite accumulation areas or central accumulation areas. And the key with satellite, give me 1 second, I have a banner now that is like on top of my screen that I was trying to get rid of, but apparently it's just going to stay there. So satellite accumulation areas are going to be at or near the point of generation of the hazardous waste and under control of the operator. Basically, under control of the operator is someone that's familiar with the operations that are generating that waste and can attend to any issues that happen with the waste and provide a little bit of controlled access. They don't have to be designated in any manner, but it is a good idea to have signage or maybe lines on the floor. Certainly facilities are going to need to know where their satellite accumulation areas are because there's different rules for satellite accumulation area containers versus central accumulation containers. So this laboratory here, can you see my cursor, Jerry?
Yes.
Okay, so this area here, this is one satellite accumulation area, and they have a label on here. So the key with satellite, again, is at or near the point of generation and under control of the operator. There can be different interpretations of what's at or near the point of generation. In North Carolina, in general, we want a line of sight to that hazardous waste container from where it gets generated. It can't be through doorways in another room. There are some case-by-case bases we make, but in general, that's what we go by. So satellite accumulation waste is limited to 55 gallons of all total of all hazardous waste in that area. So this can't be more than 55 gallons at a time. And we'll talk about what happens when you exceed 55 gallons of waste. So satellite accumulation areas can have multiple hazardous waste containers, as you saw in this slide here, and they can have different waste types. It's just limited to 55 gallons total of waste. Once 55 gallons of waste is exceeded, then the excess waste has to be dated that date, which is the accumulation start date, and moved to a central accumulation area within 72 hours. For acute hazardous waste, we'll talk about in a little bit, that has they're limited to 1 quart of acute hazardous waste. Jerry, get your pen ready, and I'm going to give you another RCRA online document number, which is 14703. 14703 is the frequently asked questions about satellite accumulation areas that the EPA has put together, and it's an excellent source of information. Again, a facility, they're limited to 55 gallons of hazardous waste in a satellite area, but they can have as many satellite areas that meet at or near the point of generation and under control of the operator. We often get asked, how far apart does one satellite accumulation area have to be from another? And this is not defined. I've learned at the state here that EPA doesn't like to make those types of decisions. They kind of leave it up to the state on what their interpretation would be. But I did find in the preamble to the rule that EPA stated a row of full 55-gallon drums spaced 5 feet apart along a factory wall would not be different satellite accumulation areas, but one satellite accumulation area. So I'm thinking the EPA is thinking at least 5 feet. And I think in general, I tell people 10 feet apart if you can. And again, there could be some case-by-case determinations that you guys may make. So this here is one satellite accumulation area, and this drum was full, and this drum was half full. So they did exceed 55 gallons of waste on that day and had a violation. This is a common lab that I see at pharmaceutical manufacturings. We have the HPLC instruments on the laboratory benchtop. Each instrument has a hazardous waste container collecting waste below. I know it's difficult to see, but they all have tags that are labeled hazardous waste and with the other markings. We would call this one satellite accumulation area. This is one distinct area. So acute hazardous waste is limited to 1 quart. And this was one of my facilities that produces e-liquids for e-cigarettes. So they have nicotine in them, the different flavors. And in order for these containers to be considered RCRA empty and the residues no longer regulated, they have to be triple rinsed. And we'll talk about that again at the end of the presentation. But the point is that these containers are subject to container management requirements until they meet the definition of RCRA empty. And this is just a close-up of one of the nicotine bottles. So they had a violation for accumulating hazardous waste that was not properly labeled. So my facility set up satellite accumulation areas for these containers to be triple rinsed. They're now marked with the words hazardous waste and with the indication of the hazard toxic. We'll talk about that in a bit, about the indication of the hazard. Consolidation, let's talk about consolidation of hazardous waste from a satellite accumulation area. Hazardous waste that's being accumulated in an SAA can only be consolidated into a central accumulation area container or something that's within the same satellite. So for example, if they had a larger container towards the end over here, they could consolidate these containers into this container because it's within the same satellite. But you can't go what we call satellite waste to another satellite area. And at this particular facility that I went to, they were collecting hazardous waste in these smaller containers. And then the lab people would pour it into a 55-gallon container that was in another room. So that was satellite to satellite. But this container really wasn't a satellite because it wasn't near the point of generation. It wasn't under control of the operator. So to correct that, the facility basically is now managing this 55-gallon container as a central accumulation area. So this is where I'm going to ask for some feedback. This is at one of my military bases. I went to this satellite area and saw these two containers. The workers showed me that this container was full and this container was about a third full. The arrows are pointing to the area where they would put the accumulation start date. Would there be any volume issues with this satellite accumulation area? Any feedback, Jerry?
No feedback just yet.
Okay. Give it like 10 more seconds. Oh, I see someone. All I can see is that there's a comment, not what it is.
All right, so Todd said yes, but did not specify a reason. And there's
Okay,
another
no, he's
comment.
right. This would be a volume issue. You can't have more than 55 gallons of waste in a satellite. Once you do, you're supposed to put the accumulation start date on the excess waste. So the questions here is to ask, how long has this been sitting here? When did you start the second drum? And in this case, they answered that it had been there more than 3 days. So once they fill up this drum and add a second drum, they have to date it. They're supposed to date it at that time and then move this container within 72 hours. And neither of those things happened. So yes, it was a violation of how much waste is allowed in a satellite. And they didn't comply with, excuse me, what you're supposed to do once you go over 55 gallons of waste. So very good.
Okay. And Robert Van Den Ecker also provided that explanation. Only one 55-gallon drum in the satellite accumulation area.
So let's talk about this. And I'm kind of curious what like he would think of this one. This is at a bottle manufacturing facility. So they make glass bottles for like beer and olives and stuff like that. This was their checker slag from their furnace. And that generated a whole bunch of waste, more than 55 gallons. But could this be a satellite? It is at or near the point of generation. It is under control of the operator. The question really is to ask, how long has this waste been accumulating? So what are people's thoughts on this as a satellite accumulation area?
Jeff Craig chimed in and he said the total allowed accumulation value, 55 gallons, is the deciding factor.
So let me preface that by saying, or explain that a satellite is limited to 55 gallons of waste, but once that's exceeded, you just have to comply with the 2 requirements to date and move the waste. So you can have a process that's at or near the point of generation that does generate more than 55 gallons of waste. It can still be a satellite. It's just they're not going to have the benefit of accumulating that waste for more than 3 days. So this was a satellite. They did label it with the words hazardous waste and with the indication of the hazards. And they put the date that the waste got accumulated and they moved it within 3 days to their central accumulation area. And they were still in compliance. So the benefit for this to still be a satellite is they don't have to do weekly inspections, which you can't. You can't let it sit there for more than 3 days. So you wouldn't have to do a weekly inspection. They don't have to have emergency equipment in the area necessarily. So it is okay to have a process that generates satellite waste. It's just all that waste is getting dated the day it gets generated and then moved to within 72 hours. Did any other comments come up about that?
No other comments,
Okay.
Andrea, but I had one. So from just based on this picture, are we to understand then that only one drum is in use at this and all the other drums
No,
are,
they're full. They're all full.
okay,
So the process, I was trying to say that a process can generate more than 55 gallons of waste at one time. And this is still acceptable as a satellite as long as they're dating all the containers and moving them to their central accumulation area within 3 days.
got it, okay, thank
So
you.
they've exceeded 55 right at the beginning, but that's still okay. The process generates all that waste. They dated all the containers, they labeled all the containers, and then they got moved within 72 hours to their central accumulation area. So they're still in compliance as long as the waste is getting dated and moved. That's why I wanted to have some interesting examples of satellites and how I know this one can definitely be confusing, but there are definitely a lot of processes out there that will generate more than 55 gallons of waste as it gets generated. And that doesn't mean they have to set up a central accumulation area right next to that. Okay, so what about this? We have is there any volume issues in this satellite accumulation area? This is at another military base. We have a 55-gallon drum of acetone. We have excluded solvent contaminated wipes, and we have universal waste aerosols. So the question is, do we feel that there's more than, does this satellite have a volume issue? There's 3 drums sitting here. What are your thoughts? It is at or near the point of generation. I think we had one comment pop up, Jerry. I just see
Yep.
the number increase. I don't see the comment.
Jeff Craig was asking, what about the 2 smaller buckets next to the drums?
That's actually a really good question, and that's not waste. I probably should have cropped that out. So I think they're probably they're in the right direction. So there is only 55 gallons of hazardous waste in this area. So we have universal waste, which does not get counted towards hazardous waste standards. And when people are managing their solvent wipes under the exclusion, those are also not considered hazardous waste. So we only have a 55-gallon drum of hazardous waste in this area. They can store universal waste, they can store used oil, they can store non-haz stuff near a satellite area. So this is really the satellite area, is just this hazardous waste container. So again, these are just various scenarios that you may run into, and you have to make a decision if there's any violations. All right, this is the last one I think I have. This is also something common that I see. This is a small metal building behind the main building where the manufacturing, this was a boat manufacturer, and this 55-gallon drum has waste acetone and gel coat. And this is a small metal building that's outside the main building, and they have designated it as a satellite accumulation area. What are your thoughts on this? Would this meet the requirements for a satellite accumulation area? No comments?
No comments just yet.
Okay. So again, this is a small metal building that is outside the main building. So the manufacturing, the boat manufacturing is going on inside of a building. The workers are generating the waste and walking outside the door across a park, like a paved area, going to this metal building and pouring their waste, not very well, as you can see with the spills, into this 55-gallon drum. I saw one comment maybe pop up, Jerry. Did anybody chime in?
Jeff said he loves the use of the grounding cable. Not everyone knows about those and why they are important.
Yeah. Most of my LQGs are pretty good with that. So the LQGs seem to be on top of it, which is not a RCRA thing. It's a fire thing for sure. But this is not at or near the point of generation of the waste. So this could not be a satellite because it's not at or near the point of generation. It's not under control of the operator. So the facility had a choice of either moving this drum inside of the building where the waste is getting generated to manage it as a satellite, or they had to turn this building into a central accumulation area. And they chose the first option. Okay, so now we're going to talk about central accumulation areas. For SQGs, the rules are in 40 CFR 262.16, and for LQGs, it's 262.17. And basically, the official definition is what you see up here, but in general, it's where more hazardous waste is being accumulated. So some of the frequently asked questions about CAAs can you have more than one? And that absolutely you can have more than one central accumulation area. And we'll talk about why someone would want to do that shortly. And central does not mean it has to be physically centrally located within the facility. You'd be surprised the types of questions that the EPA gets. They can be in any location of the facility in general. LQGs are limited to ignitable and reactive waste being more than 50 feet away from the property line. But in general, they can be just about anywhere. Now, as opposed to satellite waste, when you generate satellite waste, it has to go into a central accumulation area container. It can't go from satellite to satellite area. Central accumulation area containers can be moved from one CAA to another within a facility. They just can't have to maintain the original accumulation start date. And we'll talk about why they may do that. So the next two slides just have a summary of the requirements for satellite and central accumulation area container units. In this case, we're talking about containers. They both must be in good condition. They have to be compatible with the waste that's being placed inside the container, and they have to be closed unless actively adding or removing waste. They both have to be marked with the words hazardous waste and with an indication of the hazards of the content of the containers, which is a real mouthful. Where things get different is weekly inspections. Only central accumulation area containers have to be inspected weekly, and the date only has to go on central accumulation area containers when the first drop of waste is put into the container. Satellite waste does not have to be dated until they exceed 55 gallons of waste. So those are the two real big benefits to satellite waste, is mainly the date marking, because SQGs and LQGs only have a certain amount of time they're allowed to accumulate hazardous waste without a permit. And with satellite waste, you don't have to date it until they exceed 55 gallons. Satellite waste can, in theory, be accumulated unlimited amount of time, as long as that container is in good condition and closed and meets all the other container requirements. Whereas small quantity generators and large quantity generators have a certain amount of time they can accumulate waste before they're going to have a really big violation and most likely have penalties and enforcement with the state. Satellite waste is limited to 55 gallons total, or 1 quart of acute waste. Small quantity generators can only accumulate 13,200 pounds of hazardous waste before they would be subject to LQG requirements. And LQGs don't have an amount of waste that they're limited to, only a time frame. Personnel training is in general required for all containers, and I'll talk about this in more detail when we get to that slide. In general, you can't treat hazardous waste without a permit, but there are I believe 8 different ways that hazardous waste can be treated without a permit, and one of them is in a central accumulation container that's in compliance with SQG or LQG standards in the central accumulation area. There are area emission requirements only for LQGs that have central accumulation area containers. And then there's going to be emergency preparedness, prevention, equipment that's required, arrangements that have to be made with local authorities, et cetera, for all hazardous waste areas. So now we have a little bit more detail about all those requirements. So both satellite accumulation area and central accumulation area containers have to be marked with the words hazardous waste and with the indication of the hazards of the contents of the containers. So that's going to be ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic, depending why that waste is hazardous. And then the central accumulation area containers have to have the accumulation start date. Both satellite and central containers have to be in good condition, compatible with the waste going inside, and must be closed. Closed is another big one. Again, we have another RCRA online document that has excellent guidance on what EPA considers closed, depending on if the waste is liquid, or solid. There can be some differences on what would be acceptable for closure. And that RCRA online document, Jerry, if you don't mind putting in the chat, is 14826, RO 14826. So containers have to be closed unless actively adding or removing waste. That means someone needs to be standing there while the waste is being added or removed. If they walk away from it, that container is now accumulating hazardous waste and subject to container management requirements. So for example, these two are attached to an instrument that may take a couple hours to run. And it might not have to be like this one here is not marked with the words hazardous waste. But as soon as someone walks away from this, and the machine stops running, you're now accumulating hazardous waste in a container that's not closed and it's not labeled appropriately. And just in case, like me, you're going to laboratories and you're still seeing parafilm, this is not going to meet the definition of closed for a liquid volatile waste. The EPA specifically says that that they have to be closed to minimize volatile waste and help reactive and ignitable waste from sources of ignition. Plus, it's supposed to be able to contain the waste if it gets knocked over. And that parafilm is not going to protect that container from leaking out. They do make specially designed caps specifically for tubing that make it nice and snug. And here's an example right here. The waste has to be kept inside the container. That sounds so obvious, but I'm sure many of you, when you go to these painting facilities, you see the paint on the outside of the containers. That's a violation for SQGs and LQGs. Spills do need to be cleaned up immediately. These aerosol puncturing devices sometimes will blow back, and this container has leaks on the top and on the side. This one has on the top and on the side. This one has it everywhere. Okay, so the indication of the hazards have to be marked on the containers. And this was a feedback from emergency responders when the EPA came out with the generator improvement rule that was adopted by Florida and North Carolina in 2018. Basically, the emergency responders said, we want to know why the container, what the contents, why are they hazardous? We don't care, it's methyl, ethyl, amyl, ketone, blah, blah, blah. We don't know what that is. So that's what now requires the containers to be marked with an indication of the hazards. And this is one of the guidance documents that we have in North Carolina that we give out to facilities. The reason why things are hazardous is ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. It could be one or more of these. And there are different existing labeling requirements that may meet the RCRA requirement to indicate all the hazards. And some of them, we're going to go through the DOT, the OSHA pictograms, and the NEFA diamond point-on-point. All hazardous waste containers have to be marked with the words hazardous waste and with an indication of the hazard for SQGs and LQGs. So this is the DOT examples. Sorry, I lost my notes there. So no matter what implementation the facility is going to use, they're going to need to train their employees on what needs to be on those containers. I'm sure many of you see DOT marking on containers, especially the flammable liquids. So the thing to keep in mind is that DOT and RCRA don't always match. And I'll have an example of that on the next slide. And one of the DOT placards or stickers that you may see that does not tell anything about the waste is the miscellaneous. That doesn't give any indication of what the hazard would be with that. And you may see that at large retail facilities that are receiving returned merchandise. They tend to have a miscellaneous drum with this class 9 placard on it. This would definitely be reactive. These would represent ignitable. This would represent toxic. And of course, this would represent ignitable. So there are so many people that have industry that have given feedback to the EPA asking about the eligibility of this placard that they have finally added it to their frequently asked questions for the generator improvement rule on whether or not that this satisfies the RCRA requirement to indicate the hazards. And the answer is no. So this is the most common violation I see when it comes to marking the indication of the hazards of the contents. All the RCRA hazards have to be indicated on the container in some manner. The DOT is usually not an issue at all. Something that's DOT flammable is often RCRA ignitable. However, with the F005 spent solvents, such as toluene and methyl ethyl ketone, they're also a RCRA toxic waste. And you will see the waste codes on the manifest associated with that. And sometimes when you're doing the walkthrough, you may not have looked at their manifest yet. So you're not 100% sure if they're supposed to be marking their containers toxic, but it's something to kind of keep an eye out for sure. So this is an F005 listed hazardous waste. So it's ignitable and toxic according to RCRA. And they only had the flammable placard. They were missing the indication of the hazard toxic. So this is what they did to fix it. They just came up with their own label and put the toxic right on there. Now, the label companies, the safety companies that make the hazardous waste labels, they have now also come out with the hazardous waste labels where they can mark the boxes, but then they need to remember to mark the boxes. So this is the OSHA's globally harmonized system with the pictograms. I see these a lot in mostly laboratories. So these would represent RCRA toxic, corrosive, ignitable, and reactive. Again, when using this labeling system, training has to be done for the employees. Sometimes these container markings are already on the commercial chemical products, such as that methyl ethyl ketone you saw at the beginning of the presentation. And when they're reused as hazardous waste containers, as long as the pictograms apply to what that hazardous waste is, and they add the words hazardous waste, this would also comply with the RCRA requirement to indicate the hazards. So this is one of my facilities that was using that labeling, the pictograms. It's marked with the words hazardous waste, and I can clearly see this is an ignitable and a toxic hazardous waste. So this was a good example. The last one we're going to go through is the National Fire Protection Association, or NEFA. We have 4 being the highest hazard, 0 to 4. This would represent ignitability. This would represent toxicity, potentially, reactivity, and then sometimes you will have corrosive down here. This is do not add water. I'll be honest, this is the one I like the least, because I can tell if it's a RCRA ignitable by a 3 or a 4 because of the flash point, but I don't necessarily know if it's really corrosive or it's RCRA toxic. So this one's a bit of a mystery to me, but it is an acceptable way to mark the indication of the hazards. Excuse me. I had one facility that I cited for not indicating all the hazards, and then they sent me this picture saying that the NEFA information was on it. And I looked at that and I was like, this isn't a diamond. And after some research, I did find out that the NEFA association does require, when this is being used, that it is a diamond point on point. So this was still not acceptable. And the facility had to clearly mark the indication of the hazards. Excuse me. It's okay to mix and match the different ways that the facility wants to indicate the hazards, but they definitely need to be applicable to the waste that's inside. And I think that this was someone just trying to make a point that they weren't happy with having to mark the hazards. So if you see a facility and go behind their building and see that photo, something like that on the left, and I'm sure many of you have, definitely take a closer look. We definitely have containers that are not considered empty, and we're going to talk about RCRA empty at the end of the presentation, and they have the DOT flammable placard on here, so more than likely there was hazardous waste and it's being allowed to evaporate, so that's definitely an issue. And then this here is a foot pedal operated step can with the lid that flips up, and they're spraying a liquid waste, hazardous waste into that, and that is not going to meet the definition of empty. Let me show you that a little bit closer on the next slide. So I've actually run into, gosh, at least 4 or 5 facilities that will take their spray gun purgings with the solvent and the waste paint, and they'll put it into a bucket, and then they put it inside the step can, and they think it's closed. But if you ever look at the RCRA online document about what's considered closed for a liquid waste, it basically says that all openings or lids have to be securely affixed to the container. Again, it's to try to prevent volatiles from being released and to prevent a spill if the container is tipped over. So what my facility did is they switched to this latching lid that also has a gasket on the inside to help prevent the volatiles. And then they've got it marked appropriately right here. So I thought they did a really good job changing that. Excuse me. I already talked about parafilm. Say no to parafilm. They make special caps where the tubing will be nice and tight and prevent those volatiles from being released. And just in case anybody was wondering, GFAA is graphite furnace atomic absorption spectrophotometry, and it's used for inorganic analysis. I thought that was really, I had never seen GFAA waste before, and I was intrigued and looked it up while I was doing this presentation. So you learned something new today. So containers must be in good condition. They can't have a lot of rusting. The one on the left has severe rusting, and there's a chance that it's developed pinhole leaks. And containers should not be bulging, such as the one on the right. That's definitely an indication that there may be some type of incompatible waste inside the container. This container here has crystallization at the bottom. So that's another sign of potentially incompatible waste inside of this poly container. I wanted to mention palletized waste because I do still see this in some of my sites, their central accumulation area. The rules state that each container of hazardous waste has to be marked with those words, hazardous waste, with the indication of the hazards and the accumulation start date. So this inspection, the contractor was actually with us, and I looked at him and I said, do you feel that this pallet of shrink wrapped material is a container? And his eyes kind of got big and he said, yes. I said, really? You think shrink wrap is an adequate container? Which it definitely is not. So the hazardous waste is in each one of these trays. So this is not how they should package it. Put shrink wrap and slap a hazardous waste label on it. So this is what they did to fix it. They took the trays and put them into a Gaylord box, which was compatible with the waste. And then they had all their markings on the outside. So SQGs and LQGs have to comply with requirements for emergency preparedness, prevention, and emergency procedures for all areas where hazardous waste is generated or accumulated. So that includes satellites and central accumulation areas. So that means they have to have spill equipment. They have to test that equipment to make sure it works. They have to have access to communication or alarms for an emergency. And there's aisle space requirements as well. During this inspection, I had never seen one of these holders for the fire extinguisher. It was in the middle of the aisle, and I thought that was really clever. For some reason, I've just never seen this in my inspections before, so I included that photo. This is an emergency posting that one of my LQGs did in a central accumulation area. So this facility had a manufacturing process. They were making fire extinguishers for airplanes. And they had a work area with maybe 6 or 7 different cubicles where people were generating solvent wipes and cups and Q-tips that were contaminated with solvents. And they were putting them into hazardous waste containers below their workbenches. And at the end of the day, the facility wanted them to consolidate that waste. And they would put it into a 55-gallon drum. We talked about you can't consolidate hazardous waste from one satellite to another. It has to go into a central accumulation container. So this facility set up a central 55-gallon drum near this area, and they posted all this information. LQGs are required to have no smoking signs for ignitable waste in their CAAs, so they had that on there. But I thought this was a really nice example, even though LQGs aren't required to post all this information. It was a nice little example. So that facility, they would put the waste into the 55-gallon drum that was a central accumulation area container. And then when that one was full, they would move it over to their main central accumulation area where the waste would get picked up by the contractor. So that would be an example on why you would have multiple CAAs. And it is acceptable to move that CAA container to another CAA, and they just don't redate it. So this is an example of a weekly inspection form. SQGs and LQGs are required to inspect the containers that are in central accumulation area at least weekly. In North Carolina, we interpret weekly not to go over 7 days between the previous inspection. So that's kind of a big deal here. The federal requirements require that the facility looks for leaking containers and deterioration of containers caused by corrosion. So we like to see at least, is there any corrosion? Are there any leaks? Those are the two minimum things we need to see on the weekly checklist. Now I know Florida has a lot more, and I think I have that on the next page. There was something else I wanted to mention about this, but I think I forgot. Oh, we also, let's see. There's the Florida requirement. So it's under Florida Administrative Code. I wish that North Carolina had this much detail, especially the number of hazardous waste containers in the area. That helps the facility kind of be accountable for how long their waste is accumulating. But you can see the other things that are required in Florida for the weekly inspection. What I wanted to mention on the last slide is that the federal requirement only requires that the containers be inspected. It doesn't require documentation. So Florida, North Carolina also requires documentation, and so does Florida. So aisle space has to be maintained to allow unobstructed movement of people and equipment to get to those containers in an emergency. And North Carolina interprets aisle space to be at least adequate aisle space to be 2 feet. So that's in our general administrative code. And this is one of my military bases, and I thought this was an excellent picture that showed really good aisle space. 2 rows back to back are allowed as long as there's 2 feet of aisle space around the rows to adequately inspect those containers. And then they have all their labels turned out. I know they're hard to see, but these are the GHS, I think toxic. I call it the exploding chest. That one's toxic, and all these are their hazardous waste labels. So they have real good aisle space between these rows, which is definitely adequate. Now, satellite accumulation areas actually require aisle space as well, but it's not specified the distance. It just has to allow for unobstructed movement of people and equipment during an emergency. So if you see a facility that's blocking in their hazardous waste containers, they need to make sure that they give them some space. I think I need to speed it up a little bit, but we are getting close to the end. Here's another example of palletized waste. The hazardous waste is in each of one of these boxes. So each one of these boxes would have to be labeled appropriately. And then there's boxes here in the center that you can't even see. So those would not have adequate aisle space either. And then this is one of my military bases that has electroplating solutions with cyanides that they feed into their industrial wastewater treatment plant. So these are all hazardous waste, and there's a whole bunch of totes back here, and you can't adequately inspect these. So these both have violations. So shelving, this is another thing I've been running into at some of my sites. Shelving systems or racking systems can be a little bit more challenging when it comes to being able to adequately inspect. Containers can't be more than 1 deep unless they have aisle space behind the shelving unit. And then in general, we don't like to see the hazardous waste stacked more than 2 shelves high. If facilities want to use that 3rd shelf, that's kind of like have a discussion with your inspector to see if we feel that you can adequately inspect these. But this is one of my facilities. There was not adequate aisle space back here behind these 2 drums. They had another drum hiding behind here. That one didn't have adequate aisle space. And then this is another facility where there was another racking system right behind these drums. So this doesn't have adequate aisle space either. So the first photo you saw on the left, they pulled their racking system away from the wall. So there was more than 2 feet or 2 feet here. So they could have drums on the back that could be inspected. And then they decided to put their non-hazardous waste or their supplies on that top shelf and keep the bottom areas for their hazardous waste. So that's how they got into compliance. So this is a photo I just took like last month. These two drums here had this stuff behind it. So they don't have adequate aisle space for some of these containers, like these, right? This is the other side of right behind the drum. So these don't have adequate aisle space either for inspecting them. So what
Hey,
they
Andrew.
did, oh, sorry.
Oh, pardon the interruption. You referenced time, and we are at the 10:47
Yeah,
mark.
I think I just had 3 or 4 more slides left.
Thank you.
So I think we're good. So they pulled out these yellow hazardous waste containers from behind the 55-gallon drums, and there's nothing behind these now. It's okay to stack them. There are some limitations to stacking drums, for example, but this is how they fix their aisle space issue. This was just a mess. So I already mentioned the two drums back here don't have adequate aisle space. These containers don't have adequate aisle space. And then, oh my goodness, I've got one last question here. My facility called this metal cage with all these holes a container, and they labeled it hazardous waste. I think toxic is here somewhere. Yep, they checked toxic. Is this a container, you guys? This is what I had to sit there and think about. Where I see all these vials, this is a DEA controlled substance, and it's a hazardous waste. It's diazepam. So it's I think it's ignitable, actually. It's not toxic, it's ignitable, which they have marked right here. Do you think this is a container, this big metal cage here?
No comments just yet, Andrew.
Okay. It can't you have to close all openings on a container, and this is just full of openings. I'm like, I'm sorry, this is not a container. Each container is these little vials. So they had hundreds of containers that weren't marked with the words hazardous waste, et cetera, and then they didn't have proper aisle space. So they had to come up with a solution for that.
Andrew, there was one comment. Jeff was asking if it was a DOT approved shipping package.
I don't know if it was DOT approved, but it has a bunch of holes in it. So it's definitely not going to meet, it's not going to be an adequate container because you have to close all the openings in order for a container to be closed. And that's just full of mesh openings.
Right. And then the follow-up.
Oh,
yeah, you want to know if it met DEA controlled substance standards.
I don't know if it met DEA. They were having to meet DEA. I don't, of course, as a RCRA inspector, I don't know what all the DEA requirements are, but that's what they were doing to satisfy DEA. But unfortunately, it wasn't meeting the requirements for hazardous waste regulations. So they were having to work with both of those to come into compliance. Now, the last question I have for you guys, I thought that the other one was the last one, but do you think you can have a satellite accumulation area within a central accumulation area? This is something that I think people run into, and it sometimes could be a little bit confusing. So here on the right, we have an aerosol puncturing device. And when the aerosol can gets punctured, it's a new point of generation of the waste. So it's at or near the point of generation and under control of the operator. And you know it would take a really long time to fill up that drum. So they want to call it a satellite accumulation area, but this is their central accumulation area that they're putting it in. Do you see any issues with that? Making sure we got enough time. It is okay to have a satellite area within a central accumulation area. They just need to be able to defend why it's a satellite, which is it's a new point of generation. So it's at or near the point of generation. So they don't have to date it and they don't have to inspect it. So that is perfectly acceptable. And then I mentioned at the beginning that VSQGs weren't really noted in the presentation because they're not subject to container management requirements, but they do have to properly dispose of their hazardous waste. So if you do have a VSQG that has volatile waste with organics, such as solvents, that's not closed, then they're allowing evaporation, which is not a proper form of disposal. And then I mentioned that Florida requires VSQGs to have disposal records. The last thing I have here, which is 2 more slides about what we consider RCRA empty. And RCRA empty is a 2-part definition. So remember, it is 2 parts. The first part is they have to remove the contents by normal means, such as pouring or pumping or aspirating. And then there can't be more than 1 inch left on the bottom, Or if they're going by weight, it would be no more than 3% by weight for containers under 119 gallons. As long as it meets the two-part definition, then the residues are no longer regulated by us, and they would be allowed to let those evaporate in order to put them into the garbage. For acute hazardous waste, the container has to be triple rinsed with a solvent capable of removing whatever is in it. In this case, water does adequately remove nicotine. And that container is regulated until it's RCRA empty, which is triple rinsed. There was a change in the regulation with subpart P regarding the management of residues in pharmaceutical containers. So like blister packs, patches, syringes, IV bags, as long as they remove the P listed pharmaceutical, it is the same as triple rinsing it. So they no longer have to, like a pharmacy no longer has to triple rinse their empty containers of warfarin. So they can throw those away now once all the tablets are removed. So this wouldn't apply like at a pharmacy. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope I didn't confuse people too much for some of those weird satellite areas, and that you learned something new today. So I'm happy to take any general questions that people have.
Andrew, I wanted to circle back to a comment that Jeff typed in earlier in the presentation. He noted that empty containers need to have all hazard markings removed.
That is not a RCRA requirement. So if he's stating that for something else, it's not what's required by the hazardous waste rules. Just be aware of that. You can't tell a facility that they have to remove all the markings if you're a hazardous waste inspector. Now, if you know of other rules that require that, what I've always said is this isn't under our rules, but you may want to know that so-and-so requires you to mark off all those labeling requirements. Actually, there is, give me a second to think of the group. EPA is accepting comments for proposals for drum reconditioning facilities. And I think one of the things that's being proposed in there is that they do have to remove all the markings, but that isn't in effect yet. Anything else, Jerry?
No questions. Oh, hang on. Jeff added, and I'm just reading it now. So I have had EPA inspectors cited under container management because it communicated incorrect hazards.
If it's empty, though, it's not regulated any longer. So I don't see how they could cite that as a violation. I could see it as a container that is holding hazardous waste. If it has incorrect markings, those should be marked off. And maybe I misunderstood the question. So if it's a hazardous waste container holding hazardous waste, the markings do need to be indicate the correct hazards. But if it's empty, the hazardous waste rules no longer apply. So you can't cite someone for having a flammable placard on an empty container under RCRA requirements.
Okay, so we have another comment here from Catherine. For the example of the satellite accumulation area, that wasn't where they were carrying the waste to the external shed. I think she's referring to.
It was a gel coat and acetone waste container in a metal building outside the main building. Yes, I know which one that is.
Okay, so her comment continues to say, since it didn't meet the satellite accumulation area definition, was it by de facto a CAA? So do they have to close the CAA?
No, what we cited was that because they were managing as a satellite, so we cited it wasn't at or near the point of generation and under control of the operator. So that was the regulation we cited. So it was under 262.15, which is satellite for LQGs and SQGs. Yeah, it doesn't automatically flip it to a central accumulation area. And she's asking because LQGs are subject to closure on any CAA units. That's actually a really good question. Sometimes we struggle with what do we cite for this violation? Like those diazepam containers, they were saying this is a container, but I'm like, that container, it doesn't meet the definition of a container. So do I put that the container wasn't closed because it's open mesh, or do I put that there was 200 containers of diazepam hazardous waste that weren't marked with the words hazardous waste? So sometimes you do struggle a little bit trying to figure out the right violation. I
Okay.
think we just have maybe 2 more minutes.
Okay, I
Yep.
don't, I mean, there's one more comment from Greg circling back to the labeling of empty containers. And he said with respect, it could have just been the EPA inspector citing something or maybe misstating something.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, we know that as inspectors, we learn and we grow. And you have those oh crap moments where you're like, I've been saying that you have to do this, and that really wasn't true. So it happens. And I had it happen with an EPA inspector here as well. And it was a pretty big thing that turned into, yeah, they're managing hazardous waste when the EPA inspector said, no, it's exempt. So, and I had a conversation later and he said, I misunderstood what was happening. So, but I can confidently say, if you look at the definition of RCRA empty, which I had the citation up there, if you look at that, it'll say that the residues are no longer regulated. So how can you cite container management requirements for something that's not regulated? So I'm glad people are participating and asking questions. I really do appreciate that. And again, that's my contact information. If you ever want to reach out and ask me some one-on-ones, or if you miss the RO numbers, I'd be happy to send them to you. I'll try to include them. I'll try to include them. Maybe I can send out an email with the presentation copies, and I'll try to do the ROs as well
Okay.
by email.
One comment, Andrea, from Jack Rainey, if the diazepam container was closed with no openings, would it have qualified as a container?
Yes, absolutely. Those little sorry, there's a little bit of these are each the container of hazardous waste. So they were adequate containers. The problem is they weren't marked with the words hazardous waste or with the indication of the hazards, and they didn't have proper aisle space. So that was the violations for that.
Okay.
Yep. And
One
I
more
think we may have
comment.
hit our hour mark. So
Yep,
oops.
we have one more comment. In the
Okay.
EPA 10-step blueprint, it says EPA has exempted hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are also DEA controlled substances from regulation as hazardous
But
waste.
those are only hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. In this case, this was this isn't actually a pharmaceutical, this liquid in here. This does not meet the definition of a hazardous waste pharmaceutical. Their endpoint is a hazardous waste pharmaceutical, but this is not a pharmaceutical yet. It's just a waste contaminated with diazepam. So, but yeah, that's what I was saying is that subpart P, if you have what meets the definition of a hazardous waste pharmaceutical, so it's going to be an end product, such as a capsule or a tablet or an IV bag. Once you remove everything from that container is considered RCRA empty, even though it had an acute hazardous waste. But in this case, if they were going to empty, these aren't acute hazardous waste either. This is just hazardous waste for ignitability. That happens to be a DEA. So,
yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andrea.
Good conversation. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And have a great holiday coming up, everyone. And we will hopefully see you on our next webinar.
Sounds good. All right.